My daughter Beckett turned a year old just a few weeks ago. I know. I don't know if that's applause for her or for me. Both, maybe. She's walking now. When you see her next, you'll probably conclude, as we do, that even at a year old, that child is determined. She already looks like she's on a mission. Along with her newfound footing are a lot more words scattered around among the babbling. But in my first recollection, Beckett's first word was at about 6 months, and it was Abba, which means father in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke. But of course, language and meaning is really all about context, and as someone very clearly pointed out to me, Beckett was probably not speaking Aramaic, and that based on her family situation and her heritage, her first word was probably referring to a beloved Swedish rock band, ABBA. But either way, we're really impressed with her. Jill and I are fortunate to have two amazing father figures in Beckett's life. Beckett was brought into this world with the assistance of a dear friend of ours and his partner. And although this relationship might be more complicated for us to explain than most, I would argue that all relationships are much more complicated than they ever appear. And I would emphasize that it was important to us for Beckett to know and have a relationship with her father. And she does. Even though Beckett has and lives with two mommies, she learned to say dada first, much to my chagrin. Some speech pathologists actually argue that saying dada first is actually the sign of a happy baby. They argue that the sound that we make comes from experiencing frustration. And so if they haven't had a lot of frustration in their lives, they suggest that they won't have the sound until after the da sound. But she's got plenty of frustration in her life right now. No worries, so she can say mama just fine. But whatever her level of frustration, I can guarantee that dada and even abba, that dominant cultural reference of God the Father, will likely continue to have a significant impact on Beckett as she discovers who she is, both separate from and in relationship to God and the men in her life. Now, my relationship to God and to the men in my life was greatly, greatly impacted by my own father. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own father, but the purpose of my doing so is so that you might reflect on what you might have learned from your father, or from the absence of your father, or from those father figures in your own life, or maybe even for you to have been a father. So that you might relate to my father generationally, let me tell you that my father was born in 1950. In the last service I said, and I probably ought to repeat, that I just lost a lot of you because you're thinking, oh my God, I could be her father or her mother or her grandparent or her sister or her... Stay with me. All right, stay with me, hang on. So my dad grew up in Oklahoma City on the near north side, and he graduated from Classen High School. That means that he was a freshman when the Beatles made their debut on the Ed Sullivan Show. That's very important. And so high school years were defined by the progression and the phenomenon of the Beatles and their music for him. He learned to play the guitar in his teens and began writing music, which is how he wooed my mother. By 1967, the Beatles had released Sgt. Pepper's. The country was in the midst of the Vietnam War, and my father joined the Navy. My father never actually saw combat. He was on a ship that sailed to Korea and spent a lot of time in Oakland. And in 1972, after some very careful planning, my father left the military to return to Oklahoma at 22, married and with a brand new baby, me. My parents were just kids themselves, They returned to Oklahoma, bought a house with a VA loan, and my dad turned his medical training from the service into a steady job as a pulmonary technologist. But every aspect of their home life and my father's time away from work centered around music. My parents were in a rock band together. Don't picture ABBA here. It was more like a cross between Steely Dan and Heart. My father played lead guitar and sang, and my mother sang as well. For much of my early childhood, I actually went to sleep at night with band rehearsal in the next room. I remember at 2 or 3 standing up on a chair so that I could sing in front of a microphone, "Ricky, don't lose that number." No, I'm a little teapot for me. One of my favorite pictures of me as a child is actually my father and I sitting on the floor on orange shag carpet with matching orange drapes. My dad in his Sergeant Pepper fashion phase, so long, scraggly hair and a mustache. He has perched on his lap a beautiful old Gibson acoustic guitar that I would kill to have. And I'm about 4, sitting cross-legged across from him with my first guitar, a kid-size plastic one decorated with stars and stripes like most of the things were in 1976. My father did not fit into many of the stereotypical dad boxes. He expressed his emotions pretty well. He was always affectionate. He was good with his hands if it was with a guitar. But just about anything else he would take apart would pretty much just stay disassembled because he wasn't very good at putting things back together. We also had this thing in my dad would say, there was something called, my father's last name is Bone, so my maiden name is Bone, and he said there was something called the Bone effect. And I think this actually defied the laws of physics, where there was this understanding for our family that whatever line we got in anywhere would become the longest one. Even if there was only one person ahead of us and there were 5 people in the other line, didn't matter. It was the Bone effect. So for some reason it had that effect on us, so I grew up with that as well. He did work while my mother stayed at home in my early childhood, but he did not have any specific gender expectations of me, of what I would become or who I would be. When I think of things my dad said to me as a young child, the most memorable and often repeated phrase was, "Engage your brain before engaging your mouth." I'm still working on that. And let me say that whatever we often teach is exactly what we need to learn ourselves, right? So my memories of my father also included many times when he could have taken his own advice. My dad sometimes didn't appreciate roles of authority in his life, and he definitely devalued very openly superficial conversation. And so his commentary on authority and people who were having superficial conversations was an under his breath noise. He'd say, "Quack." And so if you didn't know him, you would think he was absolutely crazy because there would be this out of nowhere noise of a duck quacking. I also heard phrases like, "You are cruising for a bruising." Anybody hear that one? Uh-huh. And "You are walking on thin ice, young lady." Did you get that one? Mm-hmm. My dad would also tell me really fantastic bedtime stories. My favorites were stories about him when he was a kid. He would tell these elaborate tales, probably built around half-truths, but it didn't matter because they were nighttime stories and it was time with my father. We learn a lot from the father figures in our lives, what they say and what they don't say. How we relate to them often shapes how we understand what a man is and what a father is, and how to relate to the men in our lives. I was very fortunate to have a father who spent time with me as a child and who was truly interested in how I experienced the world. The message that was clearly delivered to me was that I could be anything I wanted to be, that I could do anything I wanted to do in this world. He related to me not just as a kid, but also as a person, with an assumption that we were both on a spiritual journey. Now, my father's spiritual journey involved a deep and profound love for Jesus. And later, an Eastern influence of Buddhism, and of course, don't forget John Lennon. This was a religious blend of the best of. It's clear to me now that his attraction to Buddhism resonates with his understanding of life as suffering and his need to be able to still his very active mind. And his attraction to Jesus was about a message of Jesus' relentless love and an opportunity for redemption. His adoration of John Lennon stemmed from their shared desire to express life's meaning in lyrics and music, and Lennon's deeply felt and expressed experience of the world. Now, when I was about 8, my father sat down with me and explained quite calmly and matter-of-factly that although he loved my mother, they could not live together, so he would be moving out. Now, I was assured that he still loved me and that I would still see him, but that they would not be living in the same house. It was not presented to me as terrible or horrible, and I did not experience it as such, but I know that I am very lucky. I would learn much later from my dad that his divorce from my mother was not just about their compatibility. It was also about his own ego in his 20s. He told me that he wanted to be a rock star and that he didn't think that he could do that without leaving my mother and I. He said it didn't take him long before he knew that he had made a huge mistake. But by the time he went back, my mother had moved on. And so my dad began dating, and then it wasn't long before he met and married his second wife. Now, I feel like I completely and totally lucked out on this gig. I had 2 families who got along abnormally well. Everyone just could not believe that we would celebrate my significant events in my life all together. And in 1985, my father and his new wife had a son. I was 13, so my brother hardly has memories of me before I could drive. So my sister role was much more like an aunt. I would just spoil him and give him back. Maybe that's a grandparent, but I would just spoil him and give him back. Because he and I got along so well and he looked up to me so much, I was the person my stepmother would threaten my brother with if he wouldn't do something. She'd pick up the phone or point her finger at him and say, "Don't make me call your sister." So during my brother's childhood, my dad's music became less social and a little bit more solo. He would spend hours in his recording studio with his headphones on, layering tracks on top of one another. He is an outstanding lyricist and musician. My brother and I connect most around my dad through his music. It's through my father's lyrics that we have learned about what mattered most to him. We were very fortunate to learn through his music, to have this direct view really into my father's heart about how he saw the world. My brother and I both learned to play guitar. We were both in and out of bands and would share music that we loved or had written as a way to reach our Father. Even though music connected us, my brother and I have had very different experiences of our Father growing up. My father, of course, had literally grown up before he had my brother. He was in his 30s and was quite a different husband and a different dad. But something else had a profound effect on our differing experiences of him. You see, my brother has very few memories of my father before he became ill. My father was dealt a pretty poor hand health-wise. In his 30s, he was diagnosed with epilepsy, and then soon after, it was discovered that he had multiple sclerosis. At a time before they really had the kinds of drugs that they have now to be able to keep the symptoms at bay. In his 40s, he battled kidney cancer and had a kidney removed. And in his 50s, his heart went poor, and he had to have a stent put in. Now, I have been amazed at this man's resiliency. Talk about taking a licking and keep on ticking. And I have been amazed at his deeply ingrained sense of gratitude. My dad's default personality, whether it be coming out of a seizure or coming back into an awareness from some surgery, most often begins with thank you. He jokes with the staff and manages to make friends wherever he is. But these illnesses have taken a toll on his body and have deeply affected his means of communication. About 6 years ago, my stepmother finally realized she could no longer care for him on her own, and so he is now at the VA facility in Norman. But some things have remained consistent through his parenting of both my brother and I during these very different decades of his life. He has always been interested in our journeys, much more curious than judgmental, displayed by what he says and what he doesn't say. I remember when I came out to my father, I called him on the phone to tell him. I was living in Dallas at the time, and I remember that conversation very clearly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I assumed that he was taking it in and held my breath for what was next. And he said, "Do you love her?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Then I can't wait to meet her." My father has taught my brother and I to value our relationships to those people we love above everything else. So once a month, I drive from here to Oklahoma City and pick up my brother, now 26, and we drive to Norman together to visit my dad. We usually go in the morning because he is less tired and more easily able to communicate. For a while now, it has really mostly been my brother and I who best can understand him. We can see the relief come across his face when he struggles to get out just a few words, and we assist him by finishing the thought for him out loud. He can no longer play the guitar, but he's forgotten how long it's been, thanks be to God. He can no longer write things down. But we still manage to connect around music. I play tracks for him on my iPhone of me singing some of his old songs. My brother talks about his latest adventures with his punk band. As I've gotten older and my dad has gotten sicker, I dug deep into my father's experience of the world. He didn't become the famous rock star that he wanted to be, but he was our rock star. What has persisted throughout everything are his common refrains of how proud he is of my brother and I, and how lucky he has been for loving and being loved by two amazing women, my mother and my stepmother. In a sense, I have been watching my father die slowly. But he still has moments of clarity. I showed him a picture of Beckett recently on a trip when I didn't bring her along, and he just shook his head, picking up on Beckett's determinism and her orneriness. And he managed to get out a very clear sentence with very little effort. He said, "Oh, you're gonna be in trouble," followed by a big old grin. I'm still learning from what my father says and what he doesn't say about his life and his struggle with his health. My father has tremendously affected my experience of the holy just by being open religiously to multiple understandings of God and by his default assumption that no one has ever questioned with him that this life is, in fact, a spiritual journey for everyone. I choose to apply what I love about my own father to that male language about God when I hear it in a prayer or a song. It helps me relate to think of God as Father, proud of his children, just beaming. a God with a short memory for others' mistakes and a long-term memory of love. It helps me to relate to a Father God who believes in me as much as I believe in him, who I connect more deeply to, mostly through music. And sometimes, a God who needs me to finish his sentences, to tell his story, and to be his hands in the world. When my dad was stationed in California as a young man before I was born, he nearly drowned trying to push himself to swim laps underwater in his apartment pool. That determinism is biological. You can just trace it all the way down. Anyway, he blacked out underwater. And while he was blacked out, he said he had a vision of two very different worlds. One dark and dreary world devoid of emotion, full of empty surface-level pleasures, and then this other world of light and depth and connection and love. He said he felt in that moment that he had a very clear choice to make. And so he chose love. And he woke up coughing and gasping for breath on the side of the pool back in this life. We learn from the father figures in our life not only by what they say and how they interact with us, but by how they live their lives, the choices they make, and how they spend their time. Their way of connecting to those whom they love and how they treat strangers, when they show up and when they don't, what they say and what they don't say. What does your life say to this next generation who is watching very, very closely? If you're fortunate enough to have time left with the father figures in your life, take some time today and tell them how much they have influenced you. Tell them that they matter to you. If you're not directly influenced by a child in your life, maybe you could consider getting involved as a mentor in our Partners in Education program here at the church, or in our children's or youth department. Because, as the reading mentioned, and as Beckett will likely argue much later in her life, you can't have too many dads. Happy Father's Day. Amen.